Hello, and thank you for joining me for today's presentation. I'm Steve Tompkins with Criterion, and today I'll be showing you expense management in Criterion HCM. Let's get started. First, we're going to start in the HR admin portion of the system to show you how it is set up, and then we'll show you the employee expense management and then processing that through payroll. So from the admin portion of the system, we'll click on the settings icon in the upper right-hand corner. And we're going to first set up the workflow that's necessary to process expenses. Workflows is located underneath system configuration. However, you can also search for it in the menu just by simply typing in the words like this. So I typed in just work, and you can see it shows workflows right here. I'll also show you through the menu right there. I've already created a workflow for this. So I'll bring that up right here, and you'll be able to see employee expense report. That's the name of my workflow. So here's how it is configured. You can see the name that I gave is just the same as the workflow type. Your name, if you were to name this, can be whatever makes sense to you. The module that it's applicable towards is self-service, because that is where the expense report is entered in. Here you could choose one or more groups that this workflow will apply to. You could have multiple workflows for different types of employees and different employee groups. So you may want to choose different groups and have different names for those different workflows. As with other workflows, we do have an option here for auto action. What this allows is to have the system automatically approve or reject the workflow after a certain amount of days has passed. So I might put in 3 as an example here and choose to reject it if it's not been approved within 3 days. This is totally optional. On the right side here, you can see it's currently active. You can only have one active workflow type for each group of employees. So in this situation, I just have this one, so I can keep this one active. If you try to activate a workflow that is already applying to a group of employees, you will receive a message in the system and it will tell you cannot do that. This option here is multiple approval. What this means is there may be multiple people who could approve this workflow, and you would enable this by turning this on right here. Confirmation, so there is a generic message that you'll see when we submit a workflow or a expense for approval. And this message here, where I put in confirmation text, would allow us to put in a customized message if that was appropriate. Finally, down at the bottom here, you'll see the different steps. Now, I only have 2 in my little example here. So the first step for any workflow is always the initiator. That's the person who will be initiating the workflow. They'll be clicking on the submit button. So what happens, it will become the actual submission in that situation. After that, I can do just one extra step as I've done right here, which is approval, but you can add other steps here as well. As you'll see here in this example, I could choose to have a notification sent out. I could choose to have verification or escalation. Now, the order of these, it does matter. I can't escalate before approval. So if I needed to escalate, an escalate would allow us to say, if something hasn't been approved, rather than auto, which we saw previously, somebody else maybe approves it after 2 days. If it sits for too long with nobody approving it, it moves on to another person. Notification would send a message to one or more people about this particular workflow, and then verification would come before approval. That would allow somebody else to maybe review the expense report before sending it on to approval. I have not chosen any of those, but that is an option right there. Here you'll see the actual setup of this approval. You'll see the action right there is approval. The performer, I picked employee because I want to specify one particular employee, but I could also do org type. That would be, for an example, a team leader, a manager, a supervisor. Something like that is going to be an org type. You'll see here, I could choose manager. That's how I have my system configured, is manager. But in other systems, it might be called supervisor or team leader or something like that. A position would allow me to specify an actual position. For an example, maybe the CFO is the one who approves. I could put that position in here, simply selecting the position right here, and then that person, whoever is in that particular position, would be the one approving it. And then I also have workflow 1, or position employee workflow 1, position employee workflow 2. This would be looking at the position of the employee who's submitting, and in the WF1 and WF2 fields, who is in that particular field. One or more people might be in that field. So you may have multiple people approving in that situation. If I do employee, I do need to select the actual employee rather than a position. So this is naming a specific employee to do this approval in this situation right there. One other thing on this screen is the track button. This would allow me to look at the audit of anything that has been using this workflow and where it currently stands. Perhaps one has been submitted and not approved. I could click on track and I could come into here if I had some, and I can approve them myself as an administrator. I could reject them. You'll see at the bottom, I can also purge the logs. Perhaps after a certain amount of time, you don't need to have that audit trail there, and that can be purged out. All right, after I have that workflow, I do want to check in my code tables that I have a system label called expense created. So code tables are also under system configuration. You'll see them here. Again, I could use this search up here to type in the word code, or just start typing in the word code and then click on code tables like this. So when I come to code tables, the first thing I'm going to see here is the type. It's going to be system. So you want to make sure you change that to user. And then you're going to be looking for label. It's right here. So here are various labels that are configured in my system, and you may have labels set up for things like incomes and deductions and taxes, employees, whatever you might be using your labels for. But for expenses, we want to make sure that there is one called expense or named expense that has been added to the system here. If it doesn't already exist, you can simply click add right here and add a new one, but I already have it. So the code needs to be expense, singular, and then the description, it doesn't matter what the description is. We are looking for the code in the actual configuration of expenses. So if you wanted to call this expense reporting or something like that as the description, that's okay. You can definitely do that if you would like. It does need to be active. And then default, you would not want to set this as a default, because that means any place where you might have a system label, this would be the default code that would be selected if somebody goes to add a system label. We only want it specifically in incomes, so we do not want to make that the default. All right, so once this code exists, I then need to go to my incomes. So incomes are located under payroll administration. Just like the others, I could search for that as well and click on incomes. Payroll administration incomes. I already have some created here. Now this is something where it is individual for each employer. So if you do have multiple employers, you're going to need to set up the codes for the employers where it is appropriate. And you'll see here, I have a few of them set up here. I have one called airfare, another one further down called lodging. There's mileage and parking. And let me show you what this looks like. You could call them anything you like. The code and description, they could be the same. Some people like to have codes here, maybe as abbreviation or numbers or something. That is totally optional. You'll see code and description. The employee is going to see this description when they actually go to do the expense report. So you want to make sure the description is descriptive of what they're doing. Don't just simply call it expense unless that is what you're you don't need them to break it down by what type of an expense, in which case that would be fine, but make sure this is descriptive for how your situation is going to play out. You'll see here the compensation type of cash, the pay type, this is important, reimbursement, this will affect the taxability. Calculation method, we're doing a amount on here. Of course, we want to make sure it is active. It's not an overtime component and it's not part of certified rates, so we turn those off right there. And then the most important thing right here is system label needs to have expense in here. That code that I had created, it needs to be in here for this. That's how it knows that this is an expense category when we go to do the expense reporting. Okay, I don't have any ceilings down here. This would be the maximum that could be paid out in the pay period, per month, annually, or over the lifetime. So there is a chance you might have a particular one where they can only receive a certain amount per month or something along those lines, in which case you could fill these in if you like. All right, so you would set up all the different expense categories that are applicable in your situation. As I showed, I have airfare, lodging, mileage, and some other ones out there. So just go ahead and set those all up. And then we're ready to actually use the expense reporting from the employee perspective. So that's done in self-service. So I'll switch over to my self-service tab right here. And the expenses are actually under payroll. So you'll see here under pay on the left side, this icon, and you can open up this menu by clicking this button right there, and you'll see pay is right here. Or if you recognize the icon, you don't need to have the menu open, but you'll see expense reports right there, or just like this, expense reports. Either way is going to take you to the same screen that will look like this. Now, I don't have any created yet for this employee, but perhaps the employee has already created some. They'll see other expense reports that they have created in the past. All right, here you'll see a button to add a expense report. Now, there are a few required fields when they add an expense report. These must be filled in before they can actually put their expenses down here. So we'll want to make sure that the title is here, as well as the purpose and the date. So an example of a title might be client trip to Austin, Texas. So let's say he was going over to Austin, Texas to see a client, or whatever it might be. That's going to be the description of this expense report. Here's the purpose. Now I'm doing an expense report, so I'll choose that right there. And then the date of the report. Now, probably it's going to be the current date, but you could choose any date you like in here. What this affects, though, is when payroll is being processed, by default, it's going to look for expense reports in the date range of the pay period. So let's say my pay period was January 17th through the 30th. I'm bi-weekly in this example. If I use today's date or any date between the 17th and the 30th, it would find this expense report. If I chose the 14th, it's not going to find it by default. I can, when I'm searching for expense reports in payroll, use a wider date range if that made sense. Maybe he submitted it on the 14th, but it was not approved until after the pay period had started. And so you want to make sure it gets paid. And when we're doing payroll, I'll show you how you can choose a different date. I'll go ahead and choose today as an example there. On the right side, the employee can put this expense towards a particular project or task, depending on whatever their situation is. You may not need this in your situation, but that allows you to do that if necessary. And of course, the general ledger will pick up that information when we go to generate our GL batch. Now down here at the bottom are the different expenses that are going to go onto this expense report. So simply clicking add, the employee would now go ahead and fill in these 5 required fields right here. So the title of this particular expense, and let's just say this was a hotel. And so I'll choose lodging. The date, so let's say he traveled for a couple of days, and the 18th was the date of the invoice for the hotel there, and we'll make it $575.18 there for the hotel. And then how did he pay for the hotel? Now, if he did a cash advance, gave him cash before he left and he used that to pay for it, this would not repay him because he's already used the money that was provided to him. Then the same thing with corporate card. Those are just to record it, but it's not actually going to pay him back because he didn't actually pay any money out of pocket. But cash reimbursement would assume that he used cash or his own personal card or something like that to pay for this hotel stay. All right, and then there may be some notes that the employee would like to put on there to explain what's happening. Maybe they want to be a little bit more detailed than just saying hotel, and they want to put some notes down there, and that's fine. That's not required, but they can put something there if they would like. All right, so I'll go ahead and hit save here. Now here is that entry. You can see I have the option here to show and attach documents to here, and I can also delete it. Let's say he didn't want to put this on here for whatever reason, put it on the wrong expense report or something. You can always remove that entry right there. To add an attachment, simply click on the icon there, that little paperclip icon, and then I can either browse or drag and drop an attachment in there. Let me give you an example here. I've got a hotel invoice. I can just drag and drop that right there and click on upload and attach. They can attach multiple receipts if necessary. So maybe he had an invoice for 2 different hotels and combine them into one line item here. He might attach 2 different invoices, or maybe he had some receipts for food or something like that and needed to put that down. All right, he can delete the attachment if he uploaded the wrong item. And of course, he can click on it if he wants to view it again. But once they're loaded in there, so now you'll see there is an attachment for this one. Go ahead and add something else here. Let's say he had to pay for parking. So I'll choose parking. And maybe he had to pay on the 18th, maybe $20 for parking. All right, and use cash for that as well. And of course, they can add as many different expenses in here as they need to, but you'll see that's ready to go now. So at this point, I have some options here. So down at the bottom right, I can save what I'm doing, but it does not submit it anywhere. If I click save, you'll see that it shows not submitted. And I can click back into it, make some changes if necessary. Maybe he's gathering some stuff, waiting for some invoice that was emailed. So he's just put in what he's got right now, but he's waiting to complete this. I could cancel, in which case any changes I've made would not be saved. I haven't made any changes, so I didn't lose anything. But if I had added some information and then I hit cancel, it would not save that information there. Over on the left side here, I can delete everything I've done so far by simply clicking the delete button. That would remove this expense report. And I can submit it for approval. Let's go ahead and hit submit here. So you can see now it is showing the status of submission. This has kicked off the workflow that I just showed at the beginning of this training. So you can see this is ready to go here. Now, I made it so that this person is the approver, and you'll see right here under the task, he has quite a few tasks, but in this situation, here is a new one called Employee Expense Report. And he can click on this, and here's that expense report I just created, and I can then approve it. Probably you wouldn't have the same person approving expense reports that they are submitting, but it's possible that could happen there. So we can look at this thing here as the approver. You'll see I have some options down here at the bottom. I've got reject, in which case it would send it back to the employee. If I do reject, you'll notice it says I do need to fill in the comment field. So perhaps I could say that I did not have the receipt for the parking and I need that. So you might want to type in, please attach the parking receipt. But for my demo purposes here, I'm just going to approve it. If he does hit cancel, of course, what that would do is it would cancel this action here of approving, and it would just leave it right here. It's still here under my expense reports. I have not done anything with it, and I would still need to either approve or reject it. Let's go ahead and approve it and show the next step along the way. So here you go. Do you want to approve this request? This is where you could have that custom message in the workflow. You might want to say, you agree and all receipts are attached or something like this. Instead of this generic, do you want to approve? Okay, so that is approved. Now, if I did have notifications enabled for this, if I had them in self-service, I would see them here. I would get them, of course, through email as well. So if he is the approver, he would receive an email letting him know that there was an expense report to approve. If he's the submitter, it's going to show messages that say that the expense report was submitted. And also when it's approved, he'll get a notification on that. So let's go over to payroll, and we'll see actually how the payroll is processed to bring in that expense report and pay it out. Now, I've already created a batch here just to save a few clicks, but you can see how this works. Of course, this employer must match up with the expense report that is being submitted. If I had a different employer, I'm not going to see the expenses for this employer because it's a totally different company. But in this situation, they do match up. The name, so this is just like any other payroll, you do need to give it a name here. In this case, I'm doing expenses. The pay group, you may select expenses, so you can import expenses directly into any other payroll batch, but if you want to print them separately like I'm doing here, perhaps you don't want to put the pay group because you don't want to load all the employees. You just want to load the employees you're paying out. Just depends on whatever your situation is. Okay, the payroll schedule, as you can see here, I did the 17th through the 30th. And because I chose that payroll schedule, here's the pay date. Now, all this stuff, of course, can be different if I was doing maybe an older pay period. Maybe I do monthly expense reimbursements. So I might have a payroll schedule that was monthly. And, at the end of January or beginning of February, I might process all of January's expenses. Just depends on whatever your payroll processing situation is. Okay, so here's the employee. I've already added him here, but I would simply click on Add Employee, and I would select the one or more employees who are going to get paid with this batch. So you'll see here, here's that employee. I don't have any other hours or anything on him. I just have that expense report. So I'm going to go ahead and click in here. You'll notice I have no other incomes here because I didn't do the pay group. It didn't add any other incomes to here, and that's totally fine. I don't want to pay anything else out in my situation here. However, if I was processing this with a regular payroll and there were some hours that maybe were imported from a timesheet, I would see those in here if I had already imported them. So I'm going to go ahead and click on expense reports, this button right here at the top. Here is that approved expense report. Here's the date range. So because I chose the pay period that is the 17th through the 30th, it shows me the expense report that is in that date range. Now, if his expense report happened to be dated on the 14th, but it wasn't approved until the 17th, that's fine. I can always change this date, either clicking the calendar and picking a different date or typing the date, whatever I do up here. I'm not restricted to just the pay period that I'm paying. I can choose another date range if I needed to. And I would simply check the box there to say I want to import it. If I do want to see a little bit more detail, I can click on it here and see what's happening. $595 because it's hotel and parking. You can see how that kind of adds up there. And I don't need to expand this if I don't need to. I can just go ahead and click on add. So now it's imported it. As you can see here, the incomes is going to show lodging and parking, those two income codes that I set up previously. If I had used the project and task, they would be populated right here with that information. I did not, but if I had, it would be right there. And here are those amounts that I had paid out. Now, because these are set up as reimbursement incomes, when I calculate payroll, no taxes are going to calculate because these are non-taxable reimbursements. Of course, if I had other hours I was paying out or other flat amounts like a salary or something, and I had calculated, I would have some taxes and perhaps some deductions and things like that. But in this particular situation, I just have these two reimbursements. So when I calculate it, just pays those out right there. Here you can see the gross pay $595 and net, of course, is the same. And I'm ready to move forward with payroll. Here you can see the payroll batch. I just have one employee that I'm paying. And here's the lodging and the parking. And you can see how everything is configured right there. Go ahead and approve that batch. And at this point, payroll processing is going to be, where I would go to print the check or direct deposit, depending on whatever his situation is. He's a ACH, but maybe he was going to be getting a check instead, or he wants a check instead. I could, if I don't want to do ACH, I could go in here and I could convert it from ACH into the check. And that'll combine all that into one payment. Or if he does want it as ACH, I can do that too. All right, you can see here, it's asking me, how do I want to do this? I want to do it all into this one right here and change it. So depending on whatever my situation is, I might want to issue it as a check or ACH. I could keep it as the whatever the standard was for this employee too. It doesn't really matter how I do this. And of course, now at this point, I can print my checks. Okay, I'll let that complete there. You'll notice that it shows as paid. If I had any ACH, I would just go ahead and do that and complete my batch. All right, so now that employee, of course, is being paid. So if I go back over here to his pay history, I should see it. There it is. There's the payment. He can click on that. Of course, I did it as a check, so it would have printed out paper and I would hand it off to him or send it over to him. But here is that payment that he received on February 4th, because that was the check date that was there. So that kind of completes the cycle of paying the employee. Of course, one last thing is the general ledger. Now, I didn't show the general ledger setup, but I can do that. But here is that general ledger expenses right here. If you are set to use a system like, let's say, Acumatica or Intact, you would have a transfer button here, and that would transfer that information over into Acumatica using the accounts that were set up. Now, setting up the accounts for these is the same as setting up any other income codes and their GL accounts. It's done with the GL accounts and then the GL account maps. So that is using the same steps you would go through to add any accounts for expenses. All right, so that is setting up and processing expenses using the expense management in Criterion HCM. Thank you for your time today.